Welcome back to Farm Fast Bits. My name is Diana, and in this video we are going to talk about odds ratio. So to start off, we need to understand that calculating odds ratio is different when you're considering a cohort study versus a case control study. So your first step would be to identify if you are dealing with a cohort study or a case control study before you go on with calculating your odds ratio. So what's the difference between a cohort study and a case control study? Let's start with cohort. So in a cohort study, you are starting with exposed patients and unexposed patients, and then you are following them over time to see whether or not they develop an outcome of interest. So for example, let's say I'm comparing smokers to non-smokers, and I'm following smokers through time to see how many of the smokers develop lung cancer versus how many smokers do not develop lung cancer. Similarly, I will follow patients who are non-smokers and see how many patients develop lung cancer. So it's all about looking at the exposed versus unexposed and seeing either the risk or odds of developing the outcome of interest. So for example, I could find that a larger percentage of smokers develop lung cancer compared to the percentage of non-smokers who develop lung cancer, and whether or not that difference is statistically significant, then I could go ahead and make a conclusion about the numbers that I'm looking at. Now, the tricky thing about cohort is there's two types. There's a prospective and a retrospective cohort. What I just described is a prospective cohort study, where you're starting with the exposed and unexposed, following them over time to then get to the outcome of interest. However, in a retrospective cohort study, you're still interested in looking at exposed and unexposed and the risk of developing the outcome in each of those groups, but your time frame is a little bit different. So picture yourself in a hospital and you have a database that traces back to maybe 10 years ago. So today we are in July of 2020, but I'm looking at some data that I have in my hospital database from, let's say, 10 years ago. So if I'm still looking at patients who were smokers and non-smokers and then seeing like, oh, well, let's see how many of them ended up with lung cancer 5 years ago, that I'm still following them through time. It just so happens that that time has already occurred. So that is what a retrospective cohort is. So again, it could be a little bit tricky to understand the difference, but a prospective cohort is what I described initially. In a retrospective cohort, you're still looking at the exposed versus the unexposed and following them over time, but it may be that that time has already occurred because you're using data that is already available to you. Instead of starting, let's say today in 2020, I'm gonna gather a group of patients who are smokers and a group who are non-smokers and follow them for another 10 years, that would be prospective. But if I'm going back in time and I'm still starting with exposed and unexposed and just seeing what proportion of patients develop the outcome, that would be retrospective. If that didn't make sense, go ahead and pause the video and look up some Google images on diagrams showing the difference between retrospective and prospective, and that could really help to visualize the difference. Now let's talk about case control, which is very different. If you notice, the arrows for my case control study are pointing in the opposite direction of my cohort study, and that's because in a case control study, you start with cases or you start with controls, and you go back in time to see the odds of the exposure in both groups. So let's say I have 100 patients today who have lung cancer, and I have 100 patients who do not have lung cancer. And I go back in time, and basically I am seeing out of my 100 patients that have lung cancer, how many of them were exposed to smoking? And similarly, out of my patients who do not have lung cancer, how many of those patients were exposed to smoking? And so I'm looking at the odds of the exposure in the cases compared to the odds of the exposure in the control. And another important point is that with cohort studies, you can calculate both a risk ratio and an odds ratio. However, in a case control study, you can only calculate an odds ratio and you cannot calculate a risk ratio. And the reason for that has to do with the time element. If I want to calculate a risk ratio, then I need to start off with patients who do not yet have the outcome and follow them over time and see what is their risk, or what is the risk of developing the outcome in this group of patients. So with risk, remember, you need that time element. You need to start with the patients who do not have the outcome of interest. In order to see the risk of developing the outcome, you need to, of course, start with patients who do not yet have the outcome. But in a case control study, you're deciding how many patients you're using. So I'm deciding I'm going to include 100 patients that have lung cancer and 100 patients that do not have lung cancer. I've already developed the prevalence for my own study, so I can't actually calculate the risk of developing anything, because what I'm looking at is the outcome. That's what I'm starting with. In the next video, we are going to apply our understanding of these two study designs towards calculating odds ratio, both for a cohort study and a case control study.